the Social Innovation Fund has actually been very thoughtful about how, how it works and how that relates to what's required to advance the growth of organizations. So first, these are open competitions that are evidence-based. So you have to have a threshold of evidence, so it's evidence-based funders. Strong reliance on experienced grant-making intermediaries. So the Social Innovation Fund makes grants not to the direct service-providing nonprofits, but to intermediary grant makers, venture philanthropists, foundations, others, that advance a compelling proposal for impact and how they're going to select grantees, but then they are the ones who do that. Now, the rationale for that is not only does the government get better service, because these are the best in their fields, than if we created an alternative federal bureaucracy, but in addition to that, the government is working proactively to strengthen the infrastructure that exists in the nonprofit sector. Emphasis on rigorous program evaluation, so all of the grantees have to undertake rigorous evaluation. There's a very significant match requirement, so the federal money at two different levels has to be matched one for one. I'll just describe that later, which is a way to enlist other private funders into co-investing against deals that are absolutely evidence-based, and finally an explicit mandate to capture and more broadly share knowledge. So I'll just touch on this. This goes to this question of life stage, and so startup, nascent organizations, promising with some evidence but not proven models, and proven models, and the Social Innovation Fund is targeted on the promising. This highlights how the grant program works. Social Innovation Fund, so it goes back to the 50 million would be a one-year number. It's Social Innovation Fund has an appropriation. It makes grants to the intermediaries match it, they make grants to service-providing nonprofits. So in 3 years to date, the Social Innovation Fund has actually awarded $137 million in 3 years to 20 different organizations. Those 20 intermediaries have matched one for one. Here's the public money. They have committed to raising $137 million of additional private money. Of this 274, they are making grants then to service-providing nonprofits in the amount of $220 million. So they have selected, or will have selected when this plays out, about 240 service-providing nonprofits scattered all across the U.S. And those nonprofits will get $220 million of this money, but they have to match one for one. So they are raising an additional $220 million of private money. So when all is said and done, this $137 million of public money is generating 137 plus 230 or 220. So about $360 million of private money. You combine them, that makes the SIF about a $500 million program, of which the feds have put up 137 million. But so you can see, but it's putting in motion. It's putting in motion building alliances with other funders. It's putting in motion applying evidence to selection processes and all these other things we've talked about. So I'll just acknowledge that the SIF is actually participating in every one of these segments, which if you're a real strategist, you'd say, well, that proves they're not focused, or that proves that these aren't real segments or whatever, but the SIF is participating in one way or another in all 8 of those. Just to touch on evidence, this came up in some of the conversations I've heard, but the SIF, as you can appreciate, is a very strong commitment to evidence. First, in using it in the selection process. Second, in supporting these evaluations so we advance the knowledge of what works. Finally, then, in evaluating the SIF itself. So the SIF is committed to a multi-million-dollar, multi-year evaluation process of itself to ensure that it's progressing. This is an example, just highlights 4 examples of studies that are taking place inside the SIF at the service-providing nonprofit level. But all of the ultimately 240 organizations that are picked in these first 3 years will be connected to rigorous studies like these that actually will shed light on whether a really, really important problem is being addressed in a way that's effective. And then to wrap this all up, just in 2.5 years, so we've made $137 million in grants. We've selected 20 intermediaries. They've committed an additional $350 million, they and their sub-grantees. They've selected to date 197, ultimately it'll be 240 nonprofits with evidence. Those organizations operate already in 35 states and DC. There'll be more when the last 40 are selected. They've planned 74 rigorous evaluations that encompass these 197 interventions. And as of September, the 197 organizations had documented incremental increases in services to individuals of 175,000. So, you know, in the spirit of your questions, putting a lot of stuff in motion, but also paying attention to what you're putting in motion and trying to, you know, leverage it in ways that you know, change the world. That's what it's all about. People in suits trying to change the world with powerful levers. So, thank you very much. I hope I haven't taken too much of your time, and I look forward to, you know, any questions or comments.
So before that, could you say a little bit about what you think our role is in all of this?
Well,
I think you have some opinions on that stuff.
I think you're an academic institution first and foremost, so let's just start with that. I mean, again, this is not comprehensive, but the places where, I mean, it's a Stanford Center for Social Innovation I'm familiar with. I'm a Stanford graduate myself, so I know some about their work. The Duke Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship I'm familiar with too. So those are the two that that are on here. They are absolutely focused on, no surprise, research. And they're focused on, you know, applied research very much in the context of this kind of a dynamic, very similar to this. So I suspect that they're also researching, you know, things like, you know, what's going on, how funders determine their own strategies, and how funders that have built their strategy around being evidence-based are doing it. So I suspect that there's some pretty good research going on there. And probably less so for the big academic centers in just around what constitutes good evaluation, but potentially. But certainly, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, I know enough about universities but it's certainly University of Kansas, which they always used to say, like all universities, teaching, research, service, teaching, research, service. So that's kind of what universities do. And so I think thinking about just that first with the research, their research, it's you know, is a no-brainer. It's a lot of what you all know how to do, and the need is just vast. I mean, which is a surprising thing to confront, because it's not like there's no research out there, and there are a lot of researchers, but there are just enormous opportunities to think differently or more substantively or in a way that's more focused about what are the big questions that actually that are bottlenecking taking the kinds of actions that it can actually move the dial on some of these problems. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing that comes to mind, if I go back here, strategic considerations, really goes to, okay, so let's say you're going to do, you know, research. That a lot of what you're going to do is research. Although, before I get to this, I'd say back in the context of teaching, research, service. You know, so a lot of universities get into service. I talked with several of you about a lot of the projects and work that you all do. Well, it's understandable that projects and research are hand in glove, right? Because that's where a lot of the learning comes from. It's how you can apply some of the things you're learning. So I think being an entity that provides certain kinds of services that relate to these questions is also, you know, pretty clear. Now that said, then I think the real interesting questions may be, you know, captured to some degree anyway in the spirit of these questions. So like, who are you institutionally, and what do you institutionally really care about? Okay, you're located in one of the largest, most complex urban areas in the United States. Okay, that would certainly, I mean, if we're talking about geographically, what do you care about geographically? Certainly that would be a logical thing to think about. Issue area. So what issue areas do you most care about, and how does that relate potentially to geography? Well, you've got your very clear, areas of specialized focus represented in this group. The real estate, public policy, urban planning, etc. And so you've got expertise that presumably reflects interest in certain areas. Then we go to the second question. So, what are you best at? What, or even, to refine that if I could, what are you better at? What are you better at than the other people who are interested in potentially taking on some of these challenges? And that's a huge question, because not only does it not benefit you to be a Me Too, it doesn't benefit the world for you to be a Me Too, because University of Southern California represents an extraordinary asset. And just like any of these, extraordinary asset that has, that can generate immense impact per unit of resource, or ho-hum impact per unit of resource. And it's clear that you aspire to create immense impact per unit of resource, and you exist in an environment that needs that and that will reward that. And so that's kind of initial thoughts.
That's a really good statement. One of your slides made a big distinction between direct versus macro, and I guess the universities are more on the macro side. If you could help us think a little bit about how does that macro perspective, which is research and more systems oriented, I guess, how can that better connect to the direct without actually delivering services?
Well, one way is to connect to people who are delivering services. I mean, one way or another, and I'll share with you just an immense bias if it's not already obvious, that almost everything of value starts at ground level. It starts at ground level. So I'm really suspicious of people who have opinions about policy but don't have any idea what goes on in the lives of the people that these policies are intended to affect. So I think that one way or another, my own bias again, is that to have an opinion about what kinds of policies or macro changes should be made, and ultimately that is a crucial question because they are made. I mean, policies are made, and policies and programs can either be productive or unproductive, or really productive and less productive. And that to make the best decisions about what policies are put in place or what programs are funded or whatever will be rewarded by as clear an understanding as possible about what happens, what affects lives of people on the ground. Because that's, name a topic, and it comes down to individuals. Okay, education is not about systems. Education is about individual students in classrooms learning or not learning. Okay, the system stuff is all a means to the end of influencing individual students who face learning challenges. Poverty, it's not a big, I mean, ultimately it comes to big, but in the end, poverty is about influencing the economic well-being of individuals and families who have real lives in real communities. And so they've got to be connected one way or another. So there are a lot of different ways to connect them. One can be to research at the ground level. Another way is to combine some kind of service delivery where you get the benefits of direct learning with learning through others. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to do that. So, yeah.
The question that really struck me is the reallocation question. How do you not spend money on things that aren't working? So I was looking for some models of it. If I think of corporate, large American corporations, they're not that good. It takes them a long time to turn around unless they get in trouble. They get in trouble, they might change their allocation. So IBM got in real trouble and hired a, what's his name, Lou Gerstner, who was a packaged goods man, and turned it around. But usually they're not very flexible, despite all the talk about the wonders of private enterprise. But you know where I think that a model might be related to yours is NIH, with its system of how it gives out grants. Because it has these committees, you know, what do they call panels of... The thing is that over time, new subjects will come up and they will displace the funding of other subjects. And that happens fairly naturally. And the secret is what you call your intermediaries. Only intermediaries there are your panels, you know, of experts, who are, at least, if they're put together correct, are fairly open to innovation at some level. And there you're going to have fairly, not rapid, but substantial changes of where you put your money to study, say, heart disease or something. And I think that's a good analogy to what you're trying to do with your intermediates.
Well, that could absolutely be a good model. One thing that I would note, though, is that the distinction between innovation and growth that takes place within a single organizational entity and innovation and growth that takes place within a sector. Okay, you are absolutely right that corporations also find it very difficult to change. But the good news for us as citizens and other economic entity players, animals, about the for-profit sector is that if a corporation doesn't do what it needs to do to itself continue to innovate and grow, it dies. And we, for the most part, in the aggregate, we don't pay. Now, obviously, the individuals connected with it, that entity do. But we, as in the aggregate, don't. Kodak, okay? Kodak used to be one of the most admirable, healthy, big, profitable companies anywhere. Nobody uses film. Their business disappeared. And everything else that they knew about photography mattered less to their profitability than selling film. Okay, so, to use your example, they should have been quicker to realize blah, blah, blah. They weren't. So, but you know what? The photographic segment and value to all of us is orders of magnitude greater in the post-Kodak world than it was in the pre-Kodak world. Okay, so in the aggregate, we're progressing. Alternative solutions are happening. They're being validated as superior. They're growing. We're better off. That'll lead to more, better, bigger, better, bigger, better, 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 better. The reality is, though, that in the social world, it doesn't happen. A lot of reasons. The most basic reason is because we don't know enough about what's better, combined with people who fund these things don't care as much as they should. Now, those things are arguably iterative, because the more we know, the better it enables people to care who haven't understood that caring about end result impact is even an option that they can have. Certainly, I think we could bet that as the emphasis on evidence increases, foundations will change their behavior. And they will have to change their behavior because there will be more and more pressure on them to do things that are known to have impact than historically has been the case, where foundations, especially private endowed foundations, have lived in this amazing, unreal world of no accountability to anybody but their own boards of directors, because you couldn't tell whether they were wasting their money or not. So the decision processes are largely judgment. They're largely affected by a whole host of other, other factors. I'm not saying wholesale that foundations haven't driven impact. What I am saying is that I think we can all be confident that the impact that they've created has been substantially less than hopefully will be the case in the future if evidence-based processes are becoming a more significant part of it.
And that also might be true of charities, like Red
Absolutely.
Cross versus the others.
Absolutely.
Well, you don't know where
Certainly
you should
the
get your
government.
money. Huh?
Certainly the government. Certainly the government. And the government has, look at Head Start. Head Start has grown to a multi-billion-dollar program based on, you know, a couple of studies that have suggested that early ed in general is beneficial. Okay, we can all accept that early ed is beneficial without having to believe that Head Start as delivered is necessarily the best way to deliver early childhood education. Now fortunately, HHS has changed the way they think about Head Start recently, where they're actually allowing new providers to come in and say, you know what, we buy into your commitment to early ed, but we can do better than this program. Okay, so those are the kinds of processes, but for years and years and years and years, Head Start was completely unaccountable, spending billions of dollars on faith that it was a good intervention contributing to kids. So, but again, this is about better. It's not about bad good. It's not about bad good.
So we have a question.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you, Mr. Gotcher, for coming here, for sharing your insight on this. We really appreciate having you here. I'm going to grossly oversimplify your argument, and please correct me where I misstep. But if I understood correctly, you're saying that not only do programs need to be more in touch with what's happening at the ground level, but also that there needs to be a greater use of evidence base, kind of two main pillars. Now, connecting this to Professor Bostic's point, are you saying that we need like a new class of public servant? Are we needing a public servant that is in touch with these two components?
Well, I would say there's an end and there's a means to the end. I mean, so ultimately the end is going to be something like improving people's lives. Okay, so as resource allocators, the best way I think we can determine what has impact on people's lives is by evidence. But I'm also suggesting now, if you're not a resource allocator, but if you're a program developer or an evaluator, I mean that judgment, the evidence, the configuration of a program is going to have to be informed by the reality of what happens in people's lives. But evidence can be a good way to understand that. I'm not saying that the president has to see. Was that did that clarify, or was that?
It was mostly on point. I guess I was just trying to clarify what you saw perhaps USC's role in this whole public policy program. What is our role in shaping, the future policymakers?
Well, I guess just to kind of simplify the answer to Raphael's question, my immediate input now, and I've got 3 or 4 more hours to go today, so I could change my thinking. But in general, what seems to make sense to me is that first and foremost, USC needs to determine what matters to you, what you're really interested in, and that's good, most likely going to be some rendering of types of issues and geography, some combination of issues and geographies. Okay. Then the next thing is to determine what capabilities are resident within your faculty and student base that enable you to configure interventions that will actually have superior impact, that give you the opportunity to really do way better than average stuff in contributing to moving the dial. And that also is likely to be grounded in what your interests are. But certainly, you're a research institution, so doing research is an obvious thing. You do certain kinds of service projects, or when I say service project, I don't mean like AmeriCorps. I'm talking about you do projects that add value to people. That's a real important thing to do. It's very hand in glove with research. And so surely there will be some doses of that as well. But I think ultimately what you will want to strive for is a situation where these things are where you know what it is you're trying to do, what you aspire to. You know how you judge whether you're succeeding in that. And then the set of interventions that you choose to support are logically and evidentially connected to, to those objectives in a way that ultimately give you confidence that, that your aggregated efforts have the potential to be distinctively successful.
So,
That's pretty generic. But
you've been waiting, but I also wanted you guys.
I was just curious, I know you spoke earlier about how a lot of the social innovating nonprofits have this kind of persona leadership that are often based on credentials and often, I think, crossovers from the business sector. And I'm curious if you see that as influencing how we look at evidence, output versus outcome, and coming from the business sector, seeing price and profit as a more agreed upon way of looking at outputs in the for-profit, and how that is translating, if at all, in how we look at social startups and the nonprofits.
Well, you've raised a lot of issues. What I guess I'd say in general is, and this is just my own opinion again, but is that the phenomenon of people with business backgrounds becoming engaged in the social sector is really positive. It's a really positive thing. But in the spirit, and because I think they bring a different set of skills and disciplines and so forth that, that can be of great value. What I would say there, though, if I can, quote Jim Collins in what Good to Great for the social sector. If you haven't read that, it's a worthwhile read. It's real short. It's like 30, 40-page pamphlet. But he starts off on that question about, he says, some people say that what the social sector needs is more business practices. He says, I absolutely disagree. They don't need more business practices. They need the best practices. That's an important distinction. So back to what I was saying, I'd say that because of the characteristics and the dynamics of this social sector with lack of clear accountability for different things and whatnot, that a lot of people from the for-profit sector who have built skills in an environment that is absolutely unforgiving for failure, with crystal clear accountabilities and all that, very oftentimes have different kind of mental frames and skill that can be very beneficially applied to the nonprofit sector. So I'd say in general that phenomenon has been valuable. But what I would also say is that we've got, in the spirit of Jim Collins, that it can't be about just like bringing business expertise. It can't be about just because I'm a business guy, my judgment wins. And certainly I think that there are some things, there are a lot of adjustments that people with business backgrounds, and I'll start with myself, because when I moved to Boston in 1999 to help co-found Bridgespan Group, I'd been on nonprofit boards and whatnot, but I'd never held a nonprofit job. That you actually have to be very humble about what you do and don't know, and what the value of those things are. And one of the things that I think has happened, and that slide really does kind of capture that spirit, is that you've got this like, I'm from Harvard Business School, and it's like talking to a group of investors who are also from Harvard Business School who go, wow, a guy from Harvard Business School who built a successful software company and now wants to solve workforce development, take the money. And that's not irrational. So I'm not saying that's not irrational. But in the end, even that Harvard guy has got to be able to prove that what he's doing or she's doing is actually a successful intervention. So in the end, it's got to be about the evidence. And all that other stuff has got to be a means to delivering excellent results.
We will have to end there because it's 1:30. I like ending on evidence.